When a loving father suddenly goes missing, his family is left searching for answers.
That wasn't like him to just disappear. It alarmed everybody.
My dad didn't do that. My dad was all about his kids. We were his #1 priority all the time.
Investigators make a tragic discovery in the remote Texas countryside.
In that swamp area, there are hundreds of snakes, alligators. It was a gruesome scene.
It was horrific.
As investigators shuffle a long list of suspects, a torrid romance comes into focus.
They didn't want the affair to end.
He was essentially willing to do whatever she wanted him to do.
Will I ever get the 100% truth? Probably not.
Unfortunately, when you keep secrets, they tend to bottle up and then explode.
A country boy at heart, Bobby Sexton loved everything about his hometown of Jacksonville, Texas.
My dad had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. They lived in the country most of their lives. He would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it, so a lot of people knew him. My grandpa had a roofing business, and that's what my dad did most of the time. If he wasn't doing that, he was racing.
Bobby's love for racing would also lead him to the second love of his life. Her name was Patricia Bingham.
My sister Patricia was more of a mother to me than a sister because she's like 12 years older than me. She was very, 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 very pretty. She loved to do the beauty pageants. She had God's gift of beauty.
In Jacksonville, Patricia grew up in a large, tight-knit family.
Me and Patricia shared the same mother, Linda Bingham. We lived on my grandparents' property.
A lot of people refer to that area as the Bingham family compound. Several members of the Bingham family resided on or near that property. They had a business of buying and selling junked cars to sell them for parts.
Due to her family's business, Patricia grew up with an appreciation for cars and developed a passion for racing.
We used to call her Speedy Gonzalez because she always had a heavy foot, and she wasn't scared to go fast. He got this little old truck, fixed it up, got it going for her, and started racing. She won every race she ever raced in.
Patricia's bold personality also extended to her love life.
She was very wild, very promiscuous. From what my grandparents and everybody said, she really didn't have kids her age, so she hung out with my aunt. It just so happened that my aunt introduced her to Bobby.
Bobby, he was a friend of mine. They met one night when Patricia wanted to go riding around with us. And from then on, they started sneaking around.
He was already married. And his oldest daughter was, I want to say she was probably anywhere from 14 to 16 years old. So she was nearly grown herself.
There wasn't nothing you could tell them. They were in love.
After a few months, Patricia went to my grandmother Dorothy and told her, hey, I'm pregnant. I think the situation was my grandparents said, now that you're pregnant, he's got to step up.
It was a way for them to get together and get married, but they wanted.
Bobby divorced his wife in 1991. That same year, he and Patricia welcomed their daughter, Chastity. 2 years later, they were married, and their second daughter was born shortly after.
My parents, they always took care of us. I was attached to my dad's hip. We grew up around a lot of race cars and driving race cars, racing, building them. My dad knew how to build a motor from the ground up. He knew a lot about cars.
To support their growing family, Bobby worked for his dad's roofing company. but his career took a hit when he injured his back on the job.
I don't know too much about his surgeries because I was little when all this happened. But I know he's had like 8. And my dad has a metal rod in his back. So he couldn't do much.
In 1994, Patricia gave birth to her 3rd daughter, but she received devastating news.
She found out she had ovarian cancer.
She went to a specialist in Dallas, and they told her that there was nothing they could do. She was going to have a hysterectomy. There was no way she could have another child, and they told her that. That devastated Bobby because, he wanted a son. So that took a strain on their marriage. But Patricia wanted to make things work for the girls.
By 1997, Bobby was able to return to work when Patricia's grandfather gave him a job at his mechanic shop.
It was a big shop where they worked on cars, and it was filled with wrecked cars. Everybody had their part in the family business. Bobby worked for my grandparents, and my sister cooked meals for the guys at the shop. They were happy.
But on the morning of February 21st, 1998, the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office receives a worried call from Patricia Sexton.
Patricia wanted to report that her husband, Bobby Sexton, was missing, that he had left the residence the night before.
According to Patricia, Bobby had received a call from his coworker, Willie Wright.
He was telling Bobby that Bobby needed to come down, unlock the shop because Willie had left the lights on and an air compressor running.
Willie was very adamant about him coming in, so Bobby said, okay, I'll come up and turn him off.
Patricia said Bobby left the trailer somewhere around 11 o'clock. He got into the Suburban and drove off, and that was the last time that she saw him. She went back into the house, and she went to bed. When she woke up the next morning, Bobby still was not home, and the Suburban was not there. She was upset, thinking something happened to Bobby. Normally, on a missing adult, we'll take the information down, but as far as an investigation, it's normally at least a couple of days to see if he turns up.
But Bobby's concerned family grows impatient and takes matters into their own hands.
That wasn't like Bobby to just disappear. So it alarmed everybody. My sister put up flyers asking for anybody that had seen Bobby, if they'd seen his vehicle, whatever. But literally nothing. It was like Bobby vanished.
72 hours pass, and there's still no sign of Bobby, so Patricia notifies authorities.
The sheriff's office put out a bolo, which is be on the lookout for Bobby and his vehicle.
Later that day, authorities receive word that Bobby's Chevy Suburban has been located.
Patricia actually called law enforcement to inform them that Al Clark had discovered Bobby's vehicle on the side of the road and had driven it back to the house. Al Clark was in a common-law marriage with Patricia's mother, Linda Gale Bingham, and they were living on the property owned by Linda's parents.
I got called by the sheriff's office, the dispatcher, that a man named Al Clark had found Bobby's vehicle. So I go out to the residence and look at the vehicle. It was a gruesome scene. There was blood everywhere. There was 2 to 3 inches of blood in the wheel wells. We knew that there was probably foul play involved.
My sister, Patricia, went to pieces. She knew something was wrong. The sheriff's department knew something was wrong.
Coming up, Investigators suspect a couple close to the victim may know more about Bobby Sexton's disappearance.
He wanted to know, how did you get Bobby's vehicle?
Al had been previously prosecuted for murder years before.
And a secret betrayal comes to light.
He wanted to get him out of the way.
I couldn't believe it.
2 days after Patricia Sexton reported her husband Bobby missing, his abandoned Chevy Suburban is the focus of a gruesome crime scene.
The turning point in the case that moved us from just a missing person into a homicide was the blood in the vehicle. There was just so much of it that we knew that something had happened.
Investigators turn to the man who found the Chevy Suburban, Al Clark.
Al Clark was a person of interest due to his criminal background and the fact that he found the vehicle.
Al had been previously prosecuted by me for a burglary of a building, and he was prosecuted for murder in Polk County years before. Al Clark's the type of individual that does not volunteer stuff. You have to usually ask him and get it out of him.
When pressed about how he came across Bobby's vehicle, Al admits he found it that morning by accident in nearby Diboll, Texas.
I believe it was on a Sunday. Al and my uncle, Stephen, decided that they were going to ride four-wheelers at a piece of property that my grandparents owned in Diboll, at the top of the hill. He told my uncle, hey, isn't that Bobby's Suburban? They got on the four-wheelers and went, and sure enough, it was Bobby's truck. So my uncle said, hey, let's call the laws, let's let them come. My stepdad just insisted that he drive the vehicle back to my grandparents. And that's where the sheriff's department met him and took possession of Bobby's vehicle.
Investigators ask Al where he was when Bobby disappeared 3 nights earlier.
He had an alibi. He was a truck driver and he was out of town during the time Bobby came missing.
After taking Al's statement, investigators speak with his common-law wife, Linda Bingham.
Al had left early that day to take a load of timber to Mansfield, Louisiana.
Mansfield, Louisiana was about 2 hours east of Jacksonville, and Linda said that Al had left that morning around 6 a.m.
About 10:30, his boss come to my house and said, hey, where is Al? Where's my truck and my load of timber? I said, ought to be sitting in Mansfield by now. He left early today. Way early. Well, it ain't there. And somebody told me my truck's sitting down in Maydale.
Maydale was just over 10 miles south of Jacksonville, not very far from Al's home, and Linda told police he didn't come home until early the next morning.
It was late, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, when I heard Al come in. He throws his hat down the couch and he says, I'm going to bed. Never says another word to nobody. It was strange because that just wasn't him.
Linda claims Al's actions were cause for concern.
When he got in that Suburban and drove that truck to my mother and daddy's house with blood running out the back end of it, I knew. In my heart, in my stomach, I know Al was involved.
Investigators learn Al was unaccounted for during the same stretch of time that Bobby allegedly went missing.
Bobby did go to unlock the shop around 11 o'clock, and he never did return back to the house. It was suspicious, especially with Al Clark finding the vehicle.
Linda explains the rest of the family has become equally suspicious of Al.
My grandfather, Buddy, was very inquisitive. He wanted to know, hey, how did you get Bobby's vehicle? Where did you find it? Where's Bobby?
Investigators question the uncle who found the Suburban with Al, but he doesn't offer any substantial information.
He claimed at the time that he didn't think much of it.
When investigators confront Al about the discrepancies in his alibi, he refuses to cooperate any further.
He was very irate. He said that he would not speak with investigators anymore until we had a court order or he had an attorney. We were suspicious, but we had no proof that he was involved in it.
Investigators next turned to Bobby's co-worker and the last known person to see him, Willie Wright. On Wednesday, February 25th, Willie sits down for an interview.
Willie, he was a good friend of my grandparents. He did manage the shop in the area. He didn't let people come on and steal things.
Willie confirms Patricia's story that Bobby had arrived at the shop shortly after 11 p.m. on February 20th.
Willie said once Bobby turned the lights off and locked the shop up, he left.
Willie thought Bobby went back home, and Willie went back to his trailer, and that's all he knew.
Investigators end the interview with Willie. Soon after, they receive an intriguing call about another co-worker of Bobby's, 29-year-old Michael Fielding.
Bobby and Michael, they were friends. They were childhood friends.
Michael's a country boy. He was good with his hands, good mechanic, tinkered with cars, so forth.
Michael Fielding's mother was very curious about the disappearance of Bobby Sexton. She talked to her son, Michael, asked him if he knew anything. Michael blew up, said he didn't know anything about this, and then stormed out of the house. Mrs. Fielding then called 911, spoke with the Jacksonville Police Department. She was afraid for her son.
Investigators immediately contact Michael and ask him to come in for an interview. The next day, he arrives at the sheriff's station.
The investigator for the Cherokee County District Attorney's Office interviewed Michael Fielding. It was what's known as a non-custodial interview, meaning that Michael Fielding was not under arrest.
Michael Fielding did tell the investigators that he saw Bobby Sexton earlier that day at the shop before Bobby was missing.
Michael claimed he was home all night and hadn't seen Bobby since earlier in the workday.
And he said that he wasn't involved, and he became irate to the point that he didn't want to talk to law enforcement anymore about this.
We did not believe he was telling the truth because of his nervousness and the way he was acting.
At the end of the interview, Michael was free to leave. That's when law enforcement began to place some scrutiny upon Michael Fielding.
Investigators dig into Michael's background, but there's nothing in his criminal record to suggest he's dangerous. 2 weeks pass without a sign of Bobby Sexton.
Law enforcement was just interviewing everybody and trying to explore every lead, and initially they did not have anything definitive.
Then on March 12th, a tipster provides authorities with a crucial lead.
A man calls into the sheriff's station and says that on the evening that Bobby disappeared, he saw Michael Fielding, but he wasn't in his own vehicle.
He was in Bobby Sexton's vehicle. He did notice an older man in the car that was intoxicated, and it was determined that it was Willie Wright. The more people that we were able to talk to, the more information we were getting that Michael and Willie were involved. It just all started adding up.
Those are the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle for the investigators.
On March 12, 1998, nearly 1 month into the search for Bobby Sexton, investigators in Cherokee County, Texas, receive a game-changing tip that places Michael Fielding and Willie Wright in Bobby's vehicle the night he disappeared.
friend of Michael Fielding said that early in that morning of February 21st, he got a call from Michael saying that he was out of gas and that Michael needed to come by and pick up a gas can.
He did give Michael Fielding the gas. He didn't really think anything of it. When newspaper articles come out, it jars the memory of people, and then they start realizing, this wasn't right, and they'll call law enforcement and, tell them what they know.
If Willie and Michael are responsible for Bobby's disappearance, investigators need to determine why. Conveniently for detectives, Willie Wright gets arrested on March 17th for public intoxication, so they use this opportunity to question him in custody.
I think at that time Willie was in his 50s, and he had been itinerant, a little bit of a vagrant. He looked terrible. He was aged well beyond his years.
Willie was told that there was witnesses that placed him with Michael Fielding in Bobby Sexton's vehicle that night, and Willie broke down.
He crumbled like a rose petal in August and confessed to all of this.
Willie confirms investigators' suspicions that Bobby is dead.
Willie confessed that he got Bobby to come down to the shop where Michael Fielding jumped up and shot Bobby in the chest with the shotgun.
Willie indicated he is the one that provided the shotgun that Michael Fielding used to kill Bobby Sexton. That he aided Michael Fielding in disposing of Bobby Sexton's body, loading it in the Suburban, and then going to the location to where the body was dumped.
Michael knew that area pretty well, so the decision was made that Michael Fielding would transport Bobby Sexton's corpse to one of those Exxon oil leases, leave his corpse there.
They had taken two vehicles so they could ditch Bobby's Suburban, but then ironically Michael's car ran out of gas. They got spooked, so they both jumped into Bobby's vehicle and found the next bridge to dump the body.
Michael Fielding stopped the automobile on one of the bridges over a creek in that area and threw Bobby Sexton's body over the bridge and into the underlying creek.
They disposed of a tire and a tire jack, both to weight the body down and because there was blood on it.
After they've dumped the body, they decide to abandon the SUV near Dialville, Texas, which is a short drive away, and they just left the Suburban there with the keys in it.
But the real bombshell drops when Willie reveals why Michael was involved in the murder of one of his oldest friends.
Michael Fielding was having an affair at that time with Patricia Sexton.
Michael and Patricia had been seeing each other since November for nearly 5 months. They met in secret at a hotel. Sometime in mid-February, Bobby found out about the affair, and there was an incident.
Bobby had followed them to the Southern Motor Hotel in Rusk. Bobby Sexton banged on the door, kicked on the door. Michael Fielding answers the door. Bobby sees what's happening, and they engage in a fist fight right there.
According to Willie, the fight ended when Bobby stormed out.
Bobby went home, got his girls loaded up, and went to his mother's house. And that's where he stayed.
I didn't know about Michael till Bobby brought it out in the open. They were having an affair. I couldn't believe it. Michael Fielding and Bobby went to school together. They were raised together.
Eventually, Patricia did say that her affair with Michael was over. Come home, the children need both a mother and a father. Bobby gave in and did go back, and that was just before the murder.
But the affair continued.
Law enforcement reasonably started to assume hey, maybe Patricia Sexton is involved in the disappearance of Bobby Sexton.
Following Willie's statement, he agrees to show investigators where he and Michael dumped Bobby's body.
They drive around looking, for the spot where Willie had helped Michael throw the body in. There was possibly 200 bridges that they had gone to with no luck in finding the body. And it wasn't until they moved over to Anderson County that Willie made the statement, this is it, this is the spot. And the investigators saw what appeared to be a body floating, and that's what led to us recovering Bobby Sexton's body. Once it was on the bank, we noticed that there was a shotgun hole in the chest area. He was decomposed.
He had been exposed to weather, the elements during that time, which can be cruel. And then, of course, you've got the snakes and turtles and fish in the water. And it was horrific.
The body was taken to Dallas to the medical examiner.
A subsequent search of the property where Bobby was allegedly killed turns up valuable evidence.
We walked all around the property, every inch of the place. There was a couple leaves that had a red substance on there that was later determined to be blood. They typed the blood, and it was the same type as Bobby had. My thinking is that somebody may have done something to clean up the area, because with a shotgun blast, there should have been a lot of blood, but there was no evidence found in the mechanic shop itself.
Bobby Sexton's body was identified through the autopsy, specifically the disc that was in his back. The autopsy indicated that cause of death was shotgun blast, and death was very quickly after that.
Willie Wright was charged with tampering with evidence. His part of obtaining the shotgun for Michael and helping dispose of the body. On March 26, Michael Fielding was taken into custody and charged with capital murder of Bobby Sexton.
My sister was devastated. She didn't want to believe that Bobby was gone. None of us did.
That was the end of her racing career. She took her fire suit, her racing stuff, and pictures, and she put them in the casket with him. And she said, I'm done. I won't ever race again. And never did.
When investigators confront Patricia about her affair with Michael, she denies the claims and insists that her marriage to Bobby was stronger than ever.
The looming question was, why would Willie Wright make that detail up? At this point, investigators didn't believe Patricia, but they needed more evidence that she knew of the plot to kill her husband.
When investigators finally sit down with Michael Fielding, he makes a stunning admission.
Michael Fielding, to his honor and to his benefit, readily admitted that he murdered Bobby Sexton.
But he said, without question, the driving force was Patricia Sexton.
More than a month after Bobby Sexton was reported missing, Michael Fielding has implicated Bobby's wife, Patricia, in the crime.
Fielding said Patricia told him she didn't want to be with Bobby anymore, she couldn't take it anymore, but she couldn't divorce him because he would get the kids.
Michael tells investigators that Patricia had initially come up with an idea to get Bobby arrested.
Patricia wanted to plant some narcotics in Bobby's vehicle, but that plan didn't work out. So that's when they decided that Bobby had to be murdered. And then Michael said Bobby was receiving disability benefits and that upon his death, Patricia would get a lump sum, which was supposed to be over $100,000. She wanted the money and the fact that she wanted to be sure Bobby did not get the children, and that led to her setting up the plan with Michael Fielding to end Bobby's life. Michael said that Patricia had threatened to end their affair if Michael didn't go through with this. Michael still didn't want to do it, but he didn't want the affair to end, so he carried it out.
According to Michael, Patricia came up with the plan for Willie to call Bobby to the mechanic shop on the night of February 20th.
Michael said that Bobby had walked to the shop because it was just down the street from the house.
Michael Fielding was hit behind a car and jumped up and shot Bobby Sexton in the chest.
Michael told investigators that Patricia called and asked if the deed was done.
Then Michael had asked her, where's the keys to the car, the Suburban? She said she did not have the keys. They're probably in Bobby's pocket. At that point, Michael Fielding reached into the pocket and retrieved the keys to the Suburban.
Michael says Patricia arrived to the shop just after midnight.
Patricia came and got the keys and then went and got the Suburban and brought it down. And that's when he and Willie Wright loaded the body in the Suburban. Michael Fielding believed that Patricia had cleaned up the crime scene, but he didn't see it, so he couldn't testify to it.
When asked if any of Patricia's family knew about the murder, Michael claims that Patricia had included one more person in the plot to kill Bobby.
Michael Fielding told me he and Patricia and Dorothy, Patricia's maternal grandmother, conceived the plot to murder Bobby Sexton.
Patricia Sexton was telling Michael Fielding and Dorothy about Bobby abusing her.
Patricia said Bobby kind of resented her because she couldn't give him a son. So he got very physical. Every time he got mad, he would punch a wall.
Dorothy and Patricia Bingham believed the only way Patricia would ever get her kids is for Bobby to be out of the way and ultimately result in his murder.
At first, Michael Fielding, he said no. Dorothy Bingham and Patricia just kept at him, and finally he agreed to do it.
Fielding said that Dorothy gave him surgical gloves and said he could use those in doing the murder, so there was no physical evidence.
There was also no physical evidence connecting Patricia to the murder.
While it's clear to investigators that Michael and Patricia are involved in the murder, Michael's confession isn't enough to arrest Patricia and Dorothy. Several weeks later, an unexpected informant comes forward.
Patricia's mother, Linda, was caught with narcotics and was arrested. When she was brought in to questioning, she was wanting to give up Dorothy and Patricia's involvement if law enforcement would talk to the DA about her charges, which they agreed to talk to them.
Ultimately, Linda confirmed that her mother and her daughter were in this plot to kill Bobby Sexton.
In August of 1998, authorities take Patricia Sexton and Dorothy Bingham into custody. During questioning, both women maintain their innocence.
At this point, Patricia admitted that she had an affair with Michael. She said that when Bobby went missing, she knew in her heart that it was probably Michael, but that she was too afraid to say anything. She claimed that she had no first-hand knowledge of the murder, so she couldn't truly be sure.
Patricia said Michael had been lying to us.
She refused to implicate her grandmother.
Their stories just didn't make any sense. And the evidence and statements of other people concerning the involvement between her and Michael and all that, she just denied everything. Patricia and Dorothy were charged with capital murder.
There's no more serious crime than capital murder. Pretty good chance you got indicted, you're going to get executed.
Coming up, as the case heads to trial, authorities fear that conflicting stories and unreliable witnesses will upend their case.
That happens a lot in cases like this. When people get in trouble, they start pointing the fingers at one another.
I don't think that justice was done.
In Jacksonville, Texas, authorities have arrested Michael Fielding and his lover, Patricia Sexton, for the capital murder of Patricia's husband, Bobby. Also implicated in the crime are Bobby's co-worker, Willie Wright, and Patricia's grandmother, Dorothy Bingham.
That was a hard hit for us. Once my grandmother was arrested, CPS stepped in and took us.
I was 6. My sisters were 5 and 4. What were we going to say at that time? We still weren't comprehending what was going on.
Investigators still have questions about Al Clark's alibi.
Al Clark and Bobby Sexton did not get along, but the evidence that the investigators came up with was circumstantial, and eventually Al Clark was ruled out as a suspect.
Unfortunately, in the months leading up to trial, Willie Wright passes away.
Prosecutors no longer had the key witness against Michael Fielding.
I started talking with the DA's office about ways to try to save Michael's life. The sentence that I negotiated for him with the DA's office was 35 years in prison. Part of our agreement with the DA's office was that he would fully cooperate with law enforcement, and that's what he did.
On April 20th, 1999, Patricia Sexton's trial gets underway.
There was evidence that the motive was at least twofold, that she wanted the kids and did not believe she would get custody unless he was out of the picture. She also wanted the benefits from the disability claim, even though it wasn't adjudicated yet.
Dorothy and Patricia, in my opinion, they were the ringleaders of all this. The way they kept telling Michael he needed to do this. Had they not done that, Bobby Sexton would still be alive, in my opinion.
But Patricia's defense team claims Michael had every reason to lie.
Our defense was he was in love with her. They were having an affair. That's all just a lover's triangle, and he was trying to get rid of a rival. We had some confidence that we could make the jury believe that Fielding was in this just as a jealous lover.
On the stand, however, Michael stands firm.
Michael relented that he had an ongoing affair with Patricia, and he was essentially willing to do whatever Patricia wanted him to do.
We believe he's up there lying, trying to put her in it. That happens a lot in these cases like this. When people get in trouble, they start pointing the fingers at one another.
The state's star witness is none other than Patricia's mother, Linda.
Linda Gale Bingham's testimony was a major part because she overheard some of the conversations with Patricia and with Dorothy. It was her view that Patricia acting with Dorothy were the masterminds of this plot.
What little I knew, everybody else was saying. And that aggravates me because people say, well, you're the one that sent her to prison. No. What I said, everybody else said. I wasn't going to lie. I'm not lying for nobody. My mother always said, as long as everybody just tells the truth, everything's going to be all right. Exactly what everybody did, and it wasn't all right.
Patricia's trial lasts 3 days. The jury deliberates for several hours, ultimately submitting their verdict on April 23rd.
We, the jury, find the defendant Patricia Sexton guilty of the lesser included offense of murder.
Patricia avoids the death penalty, but is sentenced to life in prison. Patricia's grandmother and alleged co-conspirator Dorothy Bingham is also found guilty at her trial in June 2000.
She received a conviction for engaging in organized criminal activity and murder.
Dorothy is sentenced to 30 years in prison, but she serves less than 3.
Dorothy Bingham's case was reversed by the Tyler Court of Appeals. It was determined that there was not sufficient corroborating evidence.
When my grandmother's conviction was overturned, it was the greatest thing. I feel like she was wrongfully convicted.
The fact that Dorothy was released, personally, I don't think that justice was done on her part, but, it's out of our control.
25 years later, Patricia Sexton continues to maintain her innocence.
There are a lot of innocent people that are incarcerated. And I will believe that she is innocent until the day I die.
I still have questions about everything that's happened. Will I ever get the 100% truth? Probably not.
Unfortunately, when you keep secrets, they tend to bottle up and then explode.
There's not too many days that go by that my family doesn't say something about my dad or talk about how they miss him or how things would be different if my dad was here.
It was very sad. Think of all the lives ruined. Think of families ruined. For nothing.
Everything a girl's mom is supposed to help her do. I didn't get that. Daddy-daughter dances, stuff that you go to with your dad. I didn't go to those. When I decide to settle down and get married, my dad doesn't get to walk me down the aisle. I'll never have a relationship with my mom. Because what she did to not only me but my family was the most unfair thing that you could have done to anybody, especially you were 3 little girls. But they say life's not fair. It really isn't.
On a quiet winter morning in Palmerston North, New Zealand. The kind of morning where nothing seems out of place and the world appears to move at an unremarkable pace. A family home became the center of one of the country's most disturbing and controversial murder cases. There were no warning signs visible from the outside, no public displays of conflict, no dramatic unraveling that neighbors later pointed to as evidence of something inevitable. Instead, what unfolded inside that ordinary suburban house would later force investigators, courts, and the public to confront uncomfortable questions about certainty, evidence, and the limits of reconstruction when a crime leaves behind more questions than answers. Inside that home lived Christine Lundy, her 7-year-old daughter Amber, and the man who would soon become the focus of suspicion, Mark Edward Lundy, Christine's husband and Amber's father. Before the events that would define their names in criminal history, the Lundy family appeared, at least on the surface, to be living a life that many would recognize as ordinary. Christine Lundy, age 38, was described as a mother whose life revolved around her home and her child. She was not a public figure, nor someone known for dramatic personal conflict. Her world, as far as those around her could see, was centered on domestic stability and the routines that come with raising a young child. Amber, her daughter, was 7 years old at the time. She was in primary school, living the early years of childhood that are typically defined by school days, simple friendships, and the comfort of familiar surroundings. To those who knew them from a distance, Christine and Amber were simply a mother and daughter living an unassuming life in Palmerston North, a city where days pass quietly and where most tragedies, when they occur, are small and personal rather than public and overwhelming. Yet beneath that surface of normalcy, there was another presence in the household, one that would later become central to every investigation and courtroom argument that followed. Mark Edward Lundy worked in sales within the printing industry, a profession that required travel and long hours away from home. He was not described as someone with a criminal background or a history of violence. In outward appearance, he fit into the category of an average working man, someone who moved between clients, meetings, and business trips. However, his work frequently took him away from the family home, and this physical distance became one of the quiet structural features of the Lundy household. The separation created by travel was not unusual in itself, but it meant that the rhythms of family life were often fragmented, with Christine and Amber spending long periods alone while Mark was on the road. Financial pressure was also part of the background of their lives. The family was not portrayed as wealthy, and there were indications of financial strain and debt. While not uncommon for many households, these pressures later became part of the narrative constructed by investigators and prosecutors, who sought to identify possible motives behind a crime that initially seemed impossible to explain. Friends and acquaintances would later describe the household as outwardly stable but not without tension. The kind of tension that does not manifest in obvious conflict but exists in the quieter realities of financial responsibility, work separation, and the ordinary stresses of family life. Importantly, nothing in the early descriptions of the Lundy family suggested violence, nor did any immediate accounts from neighbors indicate disturbances that would foreshadow what was to come. The absence of obvious warning signs is one of the elements that would later make the case so difficult for the public to process. It is often easier to understand tragedy when it is preceded by visible fracture, but in this case, there was no such clear narrative. Instead, the family existed within the boundaries of normal suburban life, until that normality was irrevocably broken. The contrast between perception and reality would become one of the defining emotional undercurrents of the entire investigation. When the events of August 29th and 30th, 2000 are later reconstructed, this ordinary family structure becomes the backdrop against which an extraordinary crime is measured. Christine, a mother devoted to her child; Amber, a young girl at the center of her early life; and Mark, a husband and father whose professional obligations kept him frequently away from home, form the triangle of relationships that investigators would later scrutinize in immense detail. Every aspect of their lives would be examined, from financial records to travel schedules, from phone calls to behavioral patterns, as authorities attempted to understand how a domestic environment could become the setting for a double homicide of such brutality. Yet before the investigation, before the trial, and before the conflicting interpretations of evidence that would divide public opinion for decades, there was simply a family living in a house in Palmerston North, unaware that their names would soon be attached to one of New Zealand's most debated criminal cases. Before the night of August 29th, 2000, the Lundy household in Palmerston North existed in a state of everyday routine that, on the surface, would not have drawn attention. Christine Lundy, 38 years old, was primarily responsible for the home and the care of her daughter Amber. Those who knew her described a life structured around domestic responsibility rather than public activity. She was not portrayed as someone who moved within large social circles or sought attention outside the home. Instead, her world was centered on stability, routine, and the quiet demands of raising a child. Amber Lundy, her 7-year-old daughter, was at an age where life is measured in school days, small achievements, and the simple continuity of familiar routines. She attended primary school and lived in the sheltered environment that most children of her age experience, where the presence of a parent at home provides a sense of consistency and security. In the absence of any widely reported conflicts or disturbances within the household, Christine and Amber were seen from the outside as a mother and daughter living an ordinary suburban life. Their home in Palmerston North was not described as isolated or unusual in structure or environment, but rather as part of a typical residential setting where families live in close proximity yet maintain private lives behind closed doors. The routines of such households are often invisible to the outside world, and in this case, nothing immediately suggested disruption. However, within that same domestic environment was Mark Edward Lundy, Christine's husband and Amber's father, whose presence in the household was shaped by a different rhythm of life. Mark worked in sales within the printing industry, a profession that required him to travel frequently for business. This aspect of his work meant that he was often physically absent from the home, staying in hotels and moving between locations as part of his professional obligations. While such travel is not unusual in itself, it created a structural separation within the family, where long periods of absence were part of normal life. This separation meant that Christine and Amber often spent time alone together, while Mark's daily reality unfolded elsewhere, in workplaces, hotels, and on the road. Financially, the family was not portrayed as affluent. There were indications that money was a source of pressure within the household, with debt forming part of their overall circumstances. While financial strain is common in many families, in later investigations, it would be examined closely as a potential factor within the broader narrative constructed by investigators and prosecutors. At the time, however, there was no public indication that these pressures had escalated into crisis. Instead, they formed part of the background texture of the family's life, a quiet presence rather than an immediate concern. Mark Lundy himself was described in general terms as a working professional without a known criminal history. He was not publicly associated with violence or criminal behavior prior to the events that would later define his life. His role as a traveling salesman meant that he was accustomed to time away from home, and this pattern of absence became one of the key structural elements later examined in forensic timelines. The distance created by his work schedule meant that his presence in the household was intermittent, and this intermittence would later become significant when investigators attempted to reconstruct the final hours before the crime. Despite these individual elements, the overall picture of the Lundy family before August 2000 remained one of outward normality. There were no widely documented incidents of domestic conflict that would have suggested imminent danger. Neighbors and acquaintances did not report a household marked by visible instability. Instead, the family appeared to function within the ordinary boundaries of suburban life, where private difficulties, if they existed, were not visible to the outside world. This absence of visible warning signs would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, because it challenged the expectation that violent crime is often preceded by observable breakdown. In a Lundy household, there was no widely recognized collapse, no public escalation, and no dramatic indicators that something catastrophic was approaching. Instead, there was routine. Christine's daily life centered on caring for Amber, managing the home, and maintaining the structure of their shared environment. Amber's life centered on school and childhood experiences, shaped by her relationship with her mother. Mark's life, by contrast, was divided between home and work, with travel forming a consistent part of his professional identity. These three individual patterns existed in parallel, occasionally intersecting, but often separated by geography and time. The family structure, while appearing stable, was defined by this separation of roles and physical presence. In retrospect, Investigators would examine these patterns not as isolated facts, but as interconnected elements within a timeline that would later be reconstructed in extraordinary detail. However, at the time, these were simply the conditions of everyday life. There was no indication that this household would soon become the center of a criminal investigation that would span decades, involve multiple trials, and divide public opinion on issues of guilt, evidence, and justice. The normality of the Lundy family before August 29, 2000 is therefore not just background detail, but a critical contrast to what would follow. It is this contrast that gives the case its enduring emotional weight. The presence of ordinary life immediately preceding an event of extreme violence. On the afternoon of August 29, 2000, Mark Edward Lundy left Palmerston North and began the journey that would later become one of the most scrutinized movements in a criminal timeline in New Zealand history. He traveled approximately 134 kilometers to Pet 1, near Wellington, as part of a routine business trip connected to his work in sales within the printing industry. There was nothing outwardly unusual about this departure. It was consistent with the pattern of his professional life, which frequently involved travel and overnight stays away from home. At approximately 17:00, he checked into a hotel in Pet 1, establishing what would later become a central reference point in the reconstruction of his movements. Shortly after settling into the hotel, at around 17:30, he made a phone call to his wife, Christine Lundy. The content of this call was never recorded, and its exact nature remains unknown, relying entirely on later interpretations and testimony. However, in the structure of the prosecution's eventual case, this call would become a critical anchor point, marking the beginning of a disputed timeline that would define the entire legal battle. Following this call, Mark Lundy remained in the Pet 1 area, continuing what initially appeared to be an ordinary evening during a work-related stay. He ate dinner alone, and no unusual behavior was documented during this period. From a surface perspective, nothing in the early evening suggested deviation from routine. However, as the night progressed, the timeline would become increasingly significant in ways that were not immediately apparent at the time. At approximately 23:45, Mark Lundy met a woman who was working as a sex worker, and the two spent time together in his hotel room. This interaction continued until approximately 00:48 on August 30th, when the woman left the hotel room. This encounter later became a key element in establishing what was argued to be an alibi, as it placed Mark Lundy in a specific location during a defined period of time. However, as with many elements of the case, its interpretation would later become contested, particularly in relation to the exact timing of the events at the Lundy family home in Palmerston North. While Mark Lundy's movements in Pet 1 were being recorded through hotel logs and witness testimony, a very different and far more tragic sequence of events was unfolding approximately 134 kilometers away. At some point during the night, Christine Lundy and her daughter Amber were killed inside their home in Palmerston North. The discovery of their bodies would not occur until the following morning, but the condition of the crime scene would immediately indicate the extreme violence of what had taken place. When Christine's brother arrived at the house at approximately 09:00 on August 30th, he found the bodies of both mother and daughter inside the residence. Christine Lundy was found on a bed, while Amber Lundy was found near a doorway within the home. Both had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head, inflicted by an object believed to resemble a small axe or tomahawk. The level of violence was extreme, with significant blood spatter and brain tissue observed on walls and ceilings within the room. The scene indicated a rapid and forceful attack, carried out with repeated blows. Despite the severity of the crime, no weapon was ever recovered, adding an immediate layer of uncertainty to the investigation. The absence of the weapon would later become one of the many unresolved physical elements in the case, complicating efforts to reconstruct exactly how the killings were carried out. In the initial stages following the discovery, the crime scene suggested a level of chaos and violence that pointed to a deeply personal and forceful attack. Amber Lundy's position near a doorway suggested movement or attempted escape, while Christine Lundy's position on the bed indicated she may have been attacked in a resting or vulnerable position. The distribution of blood and tissue within the room suggested repeated force applied over a short period of time, consistent with a sustained and violent assault. There were also indications that the scene may have been staged to resemble a burglary. A window appeared to have been tampered with, and a jewelry box was reported missing, raising the possibility that the crime scene had been altered after the fact to mislead investigators. However, whether this indicated a genuine burglary or an attempt to disguise the true nature of the crime remained an open question in the early stages of the investigation. The brutality of the crime immediately placed it under intense police scrutiny. This was not an isolated or minor incident, but a double homicide involving a mother and child, which naturally escalated the urgency of the investigation. Early police efforts involved canvassing a wide range of potential suspects, ultimately considering approximately 60 individuals in connection with the case. However, as the investigation progressed, the focus narrowed significantly, with the majority of those initially considered being eliminated based on alibis, lack of evidence, or other investigative factors. Over time, attention increasingly turned toward Mark Lundy, the husband and father, whose movements during the relevant time window became a central focus of forensic reconstruction. The emerging investigative theory began to form a sequence of events in which Mark Lundy allegedly left Pet 1 after his hotel check-in and phone call, traveled back to Palmerston North, committed the murders at approximately 1900, and then returned to Pet 1 in time to maintain the appearance of being present at the hotel later that evening. This theory required a tightly constrained timeline in which travel, the commission of 2 violent killings, and return travel all occurred within a limited period of time. Specifically, the prosecution would later argue that the entire sequence took place within approximately 3 hours. This raised immediate questions about feasibility, particularly regarding travel time over a distance of 134 kilometers, which would require sustained high-speed driving to fit within the proposed window. Critics of this timeline would later argue that the physical demands of such a sequence made it highly improbable, if not unrealistic under normal conditions. Nonetheless, within the investigative framework, this reconstruction became the foundation for the prosecution's case. At the same time, financial circumstances within the Lundy household were examined as a possible motive. Investigators noted that the family was experiencing financial difficulties, including debt, and that there had been an increase in life insurance coverage for Christine Lundy. These factors were presented as part of a broader narrative suggesting financial motivation, although they remained circumstantial in nature. The idea that financial pressure could have played a role in the crime became part of the prosecution's theory. Even though no direct evidence established intent or planning beyond inference. As the investigation developed, attention also turned to forensic evidence collected from the scene and from Mark Lundy himself. One of the most significant pieces of evidence presented was a small stain on clothing belonging to Mark Lundy, which was initially interpreted as possible brain tissue from one of the victims. This finding became a central component of the first trial, as it was presented as biological linkage between the suspect and the crime scene. However, the reliability of this evidence would later become a major point of dispute, with questions raised about degradation of the sample and the limitations of the testing methods used. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, however, this evidence contributed significantly to the direction of the investigation. By the time the initial phase of investigation concluded, a narrative had formed in which Mark Lundy was positioned as the primary suspect in the deaths of his wife and daughter. This narrative was built on a combination of timeline reconstruction, forensic interpretation, and circumstantial factors. However, even at this stage, the case was marked by significant uncertainty, particularly regarding timing, physical evidence, and the absence of a murder weapon. These uncertainties would later become central to the legal battles that followed, shaping a case that would extend far beyond its initial discovery and into decades of legal and scientific debate. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of Christine Lundy and Amber Lundy's bodies, the investigation in Palmerston North rapidly escalated from a sudden response to a structured, large-scale homicide inquiry. Police officers arriving at the scene were confronted with a level of violence that immediately signaled a serious and deliberate attack rather than an accidental or incidental death. The interior of the home showed extensive blood spatter and evidence of blunt force trauma so severe that it suggested repeated strikes with a heavy object. Despite the brutality of the scene, there was no clear indication of forced entry that could conclusively support an external intruder theory. A window appeared to have been tampered with, and a jewelry box was missing, which initially suggested the possibility of a burglary staged to conceal the true nature of the crime. However, this interpretation was not immediately definitive, and investigators kept multiple possibilities open during the early stages of inquiry. As standard procedure in a major homicide investigation, police began by casting a wide net, considering approximately 60 potential suspects. This early phase was characterized by broad information gathering, including interviews, background checks, and the elimination of individuals based on alibi verification and lack of connection to the victims. Over time, this pool of suspects was narrowed significantly, with 55 individuals eliminated from consideration. As alternative suspects were ruled out, attention gradually shifted toward Mark Edward Lundy, the husband of Christine and father of Amber. This shift was not based on a single piece of evidence alone, but emerged from a combination of circumstantial factors, timeline analysis, and inconsistencies that investigators believed warranted closer scrutiny. A central element in the investigation became the reconstruction of Mark Lundy's movements on the day of August 29th and the early hours of August 30th. According to established records, Lundy had traveled from Palmerston North to Pet 1, approximately 134 kilometers away, and checked into a hotel at around 17:00. At approximately 17:30, he made a phone call to Christine Lundy. The exact content of this call was unknown, as there was no recording, and its significance would later be interpreted differently by prosecution and defense perspectives. After this call, Lundy remained at the hotel for the evening, where he ate alone and engaged in no documented unusual behavior. Later in the night, at approximately 23:45, he met a woman working as a sex worker and spent time with her in his hotel room until approximately 00:48 when she left. This encounter provided a documented presence of Lundy in Pet 1 during the late night hours, and initially contributed to what appeared to be a strong alibi for the critical time window of the murders. However, investigators began to question whether the killings may have occurred earlier than initially assumed, or whether it was possible for Lundy to have left the hotel unnoticed, traveled back to Palmerston North, committed the crime, and returned within a tightly constrained time frame. This led to the construction of a prosecution timeline that became central to the case. In this theory, Lundy allegedly left the hotel after the 17:30 phone call, drove directly back to Palmerston North, arrived at the family home around 19:00, and carried out the murders using a blunt force weapon resembling a small axe or tomahawk. Following the attack, he was then believed to have staged the scene to resemble a burglary by tampering with a window and removing a jewelry box before returning to Pet 1 in time to maintain the appearance of presence at the hotel later that evening. The total duration of this sequence, according to the prosecution's initial theory, was approximately 3 hours. This created immediate tension within the case, as the timeline required sustained high-speed travel across a significant distance, execution of 2 violent killings, and return travel, all within a narrow window. Critics of this reconstruction later argued that the physical feasibility of such a sequence was highly questionable, particularly given road conditions and the absence of corroborating evidence, such as toll records, traffic cameras, or witnesses placing Lundy on the road during that period. Despite these concerns, the prosecution maintained that the timeline was possible and consistent with the available evidence. Financial circumstances within the Lundy household were also examined during this phase of the investigation. Police noted that the family was experiencing financial strain and debt, which was presented as part of a possible motive. Additionally, investigators highlighted that Christine Lundy's life insurance policy had been increased prior to her death. These factors were interpreted as potentially indicative of financial motivation, although they remained circumstantial and did not directly establish intent or planning. Nonetheless, they contributed to the broader narrative constructed by investigators, in which financial pressure was considered alongside opportunity and timeline feasibility. Another critical aspect of the investigation involved forensic evidence collected from both the crime scene and items associated with Mark Lundy. One of the most significant pieces of evidence was a small biological stain found on clothing belonging to Lundy, which was initially identified as possible brain tissue from one of the victims. This finding was presented as a potential direct physical link between Lundy and the crime scene, and it played a central role in shaping the prosecution's case during the first trial. However, the interpretation of this evidence was later challenged, with questions raised about the degradation of the sample and the reliability of the testing methods used at the time. The uncertainty surrounding this forensic evidence would become one of the key points of contention in later legal proceedings. As the investigation progressed, police also focused on eliminating alternative suspects and testing the consistency of witness statements and physical evidence. Despite extensive inquiry, no murder weapon was ever recovered, which created a significant evidentiary gap. The absence of a weapon meant that investigators could not definitively link any specific object to the injuries sustained by Christine and Amber Lundy. This lack of physical linkage added complexity to the case, as it required greater reliance on circumstantial reconstruction rather than direct forensic confirmation. By the time the initial investigative phase was completed, the case against Mark Lundy had become increasingly structured around 3 core elements: the reconstructed timeline of his movements, the interpretation of forensic biological evidence, and the financial motive theory. These elements formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. Despite ongoing questions about timing accuracy, evidentiary reliability, and the absence of direct witnesses or a murder weapon, the investigation had moved from a broad inquiry into a highly focused theory centered on a single suspect, setting the stage for one of the most contested murder trials in New Zealand's legal history. The legal proceedings that followed the investigation into the deaths of Christine Lundy and Amber Lundy became one of the most closely watched and deeply contested murder trials in New Zealand's modern history. By the time the case reached court in 2002, the prosecution had constructed a narrative centered on a tightly defined timeline, forensic interpretation, and circumstantial motive. At its core, the case against Mark Edward Lundy rested on the assertion that he had the opportunity, means, and inferred motivation to travel from Pet 1 back to Palmerston North, commit the murders of his wife and daughter, and return to his hotel within a narrow window of time. all while maintaining the appearance of being present in Wellington. During the first trial, held in 2002, the prosecution presented its reconstruction of events in detail, arguing that Lundy left his hotel after his initial arrival and phone call at approximately 17:30, drove the 134-kilometer distance to Palmerston North, arrived at the family home around 19:00, and carried out a violent attack using a blunt object resembling a tomahawk. The prosecution further argued that after the killings, Lundy attempted to stage the scene as a burglary, pointing to the broken window and missing jewelry box as indicators of deliberate misdirection. According to this theory, he then returned to Pet 1, completing the round trip in time to preserve his alibi. A critical component of the prosecution's case was forensic evidence recovered from clothing, attributed to Mark Lundy. A small biological stain was presented as possible brain tissue belonging to one of the victims. This evidence was introduced as a key physical link between the accused and the crime scene, and it played a significant role in shaping the jury's perception of direct involvement. Alongside this, the prosecution emphasized the absence of any viable alternative suspect, arguing that investigative efforts had eliminated other possibilities and that the convergence of timeline, motive, and forensic evidence pointed toward Lundy as the only plausible perpetrator. Financial circumstances were also presented as part of the prosecution's narrative. The jury was told that the Lundy family was experiencing financial difficulties, including debt, and that life insurance arrangements had been adjusted prior to the deaths. These factors were introduced as potential indicators of financial motivation, suggesting that the killings could have been linked to monetary gain or relief from financial pressure. Although no direct evidence of planning or intent was presented, the prosecution argued that these circumstances supported a broader inference of motive when considered alongside opportunity and forensic findings. The defense, however, challenged the prosecution's case on multiple fronts, particularly focusing on the reliability of the timeline and the scientific validity of the forensic evidence. A central argument raised by the defense was that the proposed timeline required an almost implausible sequence of events, including high-speed travel over a significant distance, execution of 2 violent killings, staging of the crime scene, and return travel, all within approximately 3 hours. The defense questioned whether such a sequence was realistically achievable under normal conditions, emphasizing the lack of independent verification such as traffic cameras or eyewitness accounts placing Lundy on the road during the critical time frame. The forensic evidence was also heavily contested. The defense challenged the interpretation of the biological stain found on Lundy's clothing, arguing that the sample was degraded and insufficiently reliable to support a definitive conclusion that it originated from brain tissue belonging to the victims. This challenge introduced significant uncertainty into what had been presented as one of the prosecution's most important pieces of physical evidence. Despite these challenges, the jury in the 2002 trial ultimately found Mark Lundy guilty of the murders of Christine and Amber Lundy. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period initially set at 17 years, later extended to 20 years. The conviction was based on the combined weight of circumstantial evidence, forensic interpretation, and the prosecution's reconstruction of the timeline, which the jury accepted as credible beyond reasonable doubt. Following the conviction, Lundy pursued appeals, but these were initially unsuccessful. However, the case did not remain settled. In 2013, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in the United Kingdom reviewed the conviction and ultimately quashed it. The decision was based primarily on concerns regarding the reliability of the forensic evidence presented at trial, particularly the interpretation of biological material that had been central to the prosecution's case. The Privy Council found that there was a real risk that the evidence had been misinterpreted or overstated, and that this undermined the safety of the conviction. As a result, a retrial was ordered, reopening a case that had already been closed in the eyes of the law for over a decade. The retrial in 2015 introduced significant changes in the prosecution's approach. Most notably, the timeline of the alleged murders was shifted from the early evening hours to a window around midnight. This adjustment was made in part to align more closely with Lundy's documented presence at the hotel during the earlier evening and late-night encounter with the sex worker, by repositioning the time of death to the early hours of August 30th. The prosecution argued that it remained possible for Lundy to have left the hotel unnoticed, committed the murders, and returned without detection. This revised timeline relied heavily on newer forensic techniques, including immunohistochemistry and mRNA analysis, which were presented as more advanced methods for determining the time of death and tissue origin. These scientific approaches were used to support the argument that the killings occurred later than originally proposed, thereby preserving the possibility of opportunity within Lundy's known movements. The defense again challenged the reliability of these methods, arguing that the science was still relatively new and not sufficiently established for definitive forensic conclusions in a criminal trial. Despite these objections, the jury in the retrial once again found Mark Lundy guilty of both murders. The conviction was upheld, and his life sentence remained in place. The outcome of the retrial effectively confirmed the prosecution's revised narrative. Despite the substantial changes in timing and scientific methodology between the two trials, the legal outcome created a rare and unusual situation in which two separate juries, under different timelines and evidentiary frameworks, reached the same conclusion of guilt, even though the underlying theories presented by the prosecution had shifted significantly. The result of the trials left the case marked by deep and enduring controversy. The absence of a recovered murder weapon, the reliance on circumstantial reconstruction, and the evolving interpretation of forensic evidence all contributed to ongoing debate about the strength of the conviction. While the legal system ultimately upheld the guilty verdict, the case remained a focal point of discussion regarding the boundaries of scientific evidence, the reliability of reconstructed timelines, and the challenges inherent in proving complex crimes without direct eyewitness testimony. The conclusion of the legal process in the Lundy case did not bring with it the sense of finality that often follows a criminal conviction. Instead, it marked the beginning of a prolonged period of uncertainty, debate, and reflection that would extend far beyond the courtroom and into the broader public consciousness of New Zealand. After the second conviction in 2015, Mark Edward Lundy remained in prison, continuing to serve a life sentence for the murders of his wife, Christine Lundy, and his daughter, Amber Lundy. Throughout this period, he maintained his claim of innocence, consistently asserting that he had not committed the crime. His position did not shift with time, nor did it diminish in intensity, becoming instead a defining feature of the case as it moved into its later stages. The persistence of this claim, combined with the evolving scientific and legal debates surrounding the evidence, ensured that the case did not fade into obscurity but remained a subject of ongoing scrutiny. In 2019, the Supreme Court of New Zealand upheld the conviction, effectively exhausting the major avenues of legal appeal within the domestic system. This decision reinforced the standing of the guilty verdict in the eyes of the law, affirming that, based on the evidence presented and the standards applied, the conviction was considered safe. Yet even at this stage, the sense of resolution was incomplete. The questions that had emerged during the trials about timing, forensic reliability, and the absence of a murder weapon remained part of the broader narrative, continuing to shape public perception and discussion. The legal system had reached a conclusion, but the case itself had not achieved a universally accepted interpretation. In 2025, after serving approximately 23 years in prison, Mark Lundy was released. His release did not equate to exoneration. Rather, it marked the completion of a substantial portion of his sentence under the conditions set by the legal system. The terms of his release included restrictions, such as limitations on returning to certain areas associated with the case and initial controls on media engagement. Although some of these restrictions were later eased, his re-entry into society occurred against the backdrop of a case that had never fully settled in the public mind, ensuring that his presence outside prison would continue to attract attention and debate. The aftermath of the Lundy case is defined not only by legal outcomes, but by its enduring impact on those who followed it, studied it, and were affected by it. For the families involved, the loss of Christine and Amber Lundy remained the central and irreversible fact, unaffected by legal arguments or public opinion. Their deaths, marked by extreme violence and the absence of clear resolution, represent the human cost at the heart of the case. The legal process, regardless of its conclusions, cannot restore what was lost, and this reality forms the emotional foundation upon which all subsequent analysis rests. Beyond the immediate family, the case influenced broader discussions within New Zealand about the nature of evidence, the role of forensic science, and the standards required for criminal conviction. One of the most significant aspects of the case is the reliance on circumstantial evidence. There was no direct eyewitness account of the crime, no recovered weapon, and no single piece of evidence that conclusively established the sequence of events. Instead, the case was built through reconstruction, inference, and the interpretation of available data. This reliance on indirect evidence is not uncommon in complex criminal cases, but in the Lundy case, it became particularly prominent due to the scale of the crime and the absence of definitive physical proof. The evolution of forensic science within the case also played a critical role in shaping its legacy. The transition from the original interpretation of biological material as brain tissue to the later use of techniques such as immunohistochemistry and mRNA analysis reflects the dynamic nature of scientific methods in legal contexts. These developments raised important questions about how scientific evidence is evaluated, how its reliability is assessed, and how it should be presented in court. For some observers, the use of newer and less established methods introduced uncertainty, while for others, it represented progress and refinement in forensic capability. This divergence of interpretation contributed to the broader division of opinion surrounding the case. Another defining feature of the aftermath is the existence of two distinct prosecution timelines presented in separate trials, both leading to the same conclusion of guilt. In the first trial, the alleged time of the murders was placed in the early evening, requiring a rapid and tightly constrained sequence of travel and action. In the retrial, the timeline shifted to the early hours of the morning, altering the framework within which opportunity was assessed. The fact that two different temporal reconstructions could both support a conviction has been a focal point for debate, raising questions about the flexibility of narrative within legal proceedings and the degree to which conclusions are shaped by interpretation rather than immutable fact. Public opinion in New Zealand has remained divided, with some accepting the verdicts as justified based on the totality of evidence, and others expressing concern that the case may represent a potential miscarriage of justice. This division is not simply a matter of differing viewpoints, but reflects deeper questions about trust in institutions, the interpretation of complex evidence, and the threshold for certainty in criminal law. The Lundy case has therefore become more than a single event. It has evolved into a reference point for discussions about the nature of proof, the limits of reconstruction, and the challenges inherent in resolving cases where direct evidence is limited. At its core, the case leaves behind a series of unresolved tensions. The The legal system has delivered its judgments. Yet the absence of a universally accepted narrative means that the case continues to exist in a state of partial ambiguity. This ambiguity does not diminish the gravity of the crime or the significance of the loss, but it does shape the way in which the case is remembered and understood. It stands as an example of how complex criminal cases can extend beyond the boundaries of the courtroom, influencing public discourse and raising questions that persist long after formal proceedings have concluded. In reflecting on the Lundy case, one is left not with a sense of closure, but with an awareness of the limits of certainty. The deaths of Christine and Amber Lundy remain the defining reality, an event that cannot be undone or fully explained in a way that satisfies all perspectives. The legal conclusions provide one form of answer, but they coexist with ongoing doubt and debate, illustrating the challenges of achieving definitive resolution in cases where evidence is contested and interpretation plays a central role. This enduring uncertainty is perhaps the most lasting legacy of the case, ensuring that it continues to be examined, discussed, and remembered as one of the most complex and divisive criminal cases in New Zealand's history. The story of the Lundy case does not end with a verdict, a sentence, or even with release from prison. Instead, it lingers in a space that is more difficult to define, where facts, interpretations, and unanswered questions continue to exist side by side without fully resolving into a single, uncontested narrative. In many criminal cases, the conclusion of legal proceedings provides a sense of closure, even if imperfect, allowing events to settle into a fixed place within public memory. In this case, however, that sense of closure remains incomplete. The passage of time has not simplified the story. Rather, it has preserved its complexity, ensuring that each element, every timeline, every piece of evidence, every legal argument continues to be examined in light of both what is known and what remains uncertain. At the center of this enduring uncertainty are the deaths of Christine Lundy and her daughter Amber, events that cannot be altered or reversed. Their loss remains the fixed point around which all discussion revolves, unaffected by changes in legal interpretation or shifts in public opinion. Regardless of how the case is viewed, whether through the lens of certainty or doubt, the outcome for the victims is unchanged. This reality anchors the narrative in something that is both undeniable and deeply human, reminding observers that beyond the legal arguments and forensic debates, there were two lives that ended in an act of extreme violence within the supposed safety of their own home. For those who seek definitive answers, the Lundy case offers a different kind of lesson. It illustrates how the pursuit of certainty in complex criminal investigations can encounter limits, particularly when evidence is largely circumstantial and dependent on reconstruction. The absence of a murder weapon, the lack of direct eyewitness testimony, and the reliance on evolving scientific methods all contribute to a framework in which conclusions must be drawn from incomplete information. This does not necessarily invalidate those conclusions, but it does highlight the degree to which they depend on interpretation. In this sense, the case becomes an example of how the legal system operates within constraints, balancing the need for resolution with the reality that not all questions can be answered with absolute clarity. The existence of two separate trials, each presenting a different timeline for the same crime, further underscores this complexity. That both timelines could lead to the same outcome, a conviction, raises questions about how narratives are constructed in court and how evidence is organized to support those narratives. It suggests that within the boundaries of available information, multiple interpretations can coexist, each capable of being presented as coherent and persuasive. This does not necessarily imply error, but it does invite reflection on the nature of proof and the standards by which certainty is established. For some observers, this aspect of the case reinforces confidence in the legal process. demonstrating its ability to adapt and incorporate new evidence. For others, it introduces doubt, suggesting that the flexibility of interpretation may leave room for uncertainty that cannot be fully resolved. The role of forensic science in the case also contributes to its lasting significance. The transition from the initial interpretation of biological evidence to the later use of advanced techniques such as immunohistochemistry and mRNA analysis reflects the evolving nature of scientific inquiry within the legal system. These methods, while offering new possibilities for analysis, also raise questions about reliability, validation, and the standards required for their acceptance in court. The Lundy case, therefore, becomes part of a broader conversation about how science is integrated into legal proceedings and how the limitations of both fields intersect when applied to real-world situations. Public response to the case continues to reflect a division that has not diminished over time. Some view the conviction as justified, based on the totality of evidence and the conclusions reached by multiple courts. Others remain unconvinced, pointing to the absence of definitive proof and the shifting nature of the prosecution's arguments as reasons for continued doubt. This division is not easily reconciled, as it is rooted in differing perspectives on what constitutes sufficient evidence and how uncertainty should be interpreted. The case, therefore, exists in a state of ongoing dialogue, where conclusions are not universally accepted and where new interpretations can emerge as the context evolves. For the legal system, the Lundy case serves as a reminder of both its strengths and its limitations. It demonstrates the capacity to investigate complex crimes, to conduct thorough trials, and to revisit conclusions when new concerns arise. At the same time, it highlights the challenges of achieving certainty in cases where direct evidence is limited and where reconstruction plays a central role. The system is designed to reach decisions based on available information, but those decisions do not always eliminate doubt entirely. This tension between resolution and uncertainty is inherent in the process, and the Lundy case brings it into sharp focus. In the broader context of true crime narratives, the case resists simple categorization. It is not a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end in the traditional sense. Instead, it is a layered account in which each stage, investigation, trial, appeal, retrial, and aftermath, adds complexity rather than resolution. This structure challenges the expectation that every story will lead to a definitive conclusion, and instead presents a reality in which ambiguity persists. For listeners and observers, this can be unsettling, but it also reflects the true nature of many real-world cases, where certainty is not always attainable. Ultimately, the enduring impact of the Lundy case lies in its ability to provoke reflection. It asks difficult questions about how truth is established, how evidence is interpreted, and how justice is defined in situations where clarity is limited. It reminds us that legal conclusions, while authoritative, do not always align perfectly with public perception, and that the search for understanding can continue long after formal proceedings have ended. In this way, the case becomes more than a record of events. It becomes a point of reference for ongoing discussions about the nature of justice itself. And in that ongoing discussion, the memory of Christine and Amber Lundy remains central, not as abstract figures within a legal debate, but as individuals whose lives were irrevocably taken, leaving behind a story that continues to be told, examined, and questioned without a final, universally accepted answer. As time moves further away from August 2000, the Lundy case continues to exist not only as a legal record, but as a lasting presence within discussions about crime, evidence, and the limits of certainty. Cases like this do not simply conclude when a court delivers its decision. Instead, they evolve, shaped by ongoing reflection, shifting perspectives, and the broader context in which they are remembered. In the years following the final legal rulings and the eventual release of Mark Edward Lundy in 2025 after more than 2 decades in prison, the case has remained embedded in public consciousness, not because it offers clear answers, but because it resists them. This resistance to closure is part of what gives the case its enduring weight. It does not allow itself to be simplified into a single, uncontested version of events. Instead, it presents a set of facts that have been interpreted in different ways at different times, each interpretation carrying its own logic, yet none fully eliminating doubt. At the center of this enduring narrative are the lives of Christine Lundy and her daughter Amber, whose deaths remain the defining reality that cannot be altered by legal outcomes or public debate. Their absence is the one element that is not subject to interpretation. It is the constant against which all other elements are measured. In many ways, the continued discussion of the case is also a reflection of a need to understand how such a loss could occur, and whether the explanations provided are sufficient to account for it. This need for understanding is not unique to this case, but here it is intensified by the presence of unresolved questions and competing interpretations. The case also highlights the role of narrative in shaping how events are understood. In the courtroom, narratives are constructed to organize evidence into a coherent sequence, allowing juries to assess what is presented and reach a verdict. In the Lundy case, 2 different narratives were presented in 2 separate trials, each proposing a different timeline for the same crime, yet both resulting in the same conclusion. This aspect of the case has drawn attention not only to the evidence itself, but to the way in which evidence is framed, interpreted, and communicated. It raises questions about how certainty is established when multiple explanations can be made to fit within the available facts. The presence of these dual narratives does not necessarily indicate error, but it does illustrate the complexity of cases where reconstruction plays a central role. The influence of forensic science on the case further contributes to its long-term significance. Over the course of the legal proceedings, different scientific approaches were used to interpret biological evidence, each reflecting the methods and understanding available at the time. The transition from earlier interpretations to more advanced techniques, such as immunohistochemistry and mRNA analysis, demonstrates how scientific progress can reshape the way evidence is viewed. At the same time, it underscores the challenges of applying evolving methods within a legal framework that requires clear and reliable conclusions. The debates that emerged around these techniques in the Lundy case continue to inform broader discussions about the role of science in the justice system, particularly in cases where outcomes depend heavily on expert interpretation. Another lasting aspect of the case is its impact on public perception of the legal process. The fact that the case involved multiple trials, an overturned conviction, and a subsequent reconviction has contributed to a sense of complexity that is not easily resolved. For some, this sequence demonstrates the strength of the system, showing that it is capable of revisiting decisions and correcting potential errors. For others, it raises concerns about consistency and the possibility that conclusions may be influenced by changing interpretations rather than definitive evidence. This divergence in perception reflects broader questions about trust in institutions and the degree to which legal outcomes can be considered final in cases where uncertainty remains. The absence of a recovered murder weapon continues to stand as one of the most significant unresolved elements in the case. In many criminal investigations, the identification of a weapon provides a tangible link between the suspect and the crime, helping to establish both method and opportunity. In the Lundy case, this link was never found, leaving a gap that had to be filled through inference and reconstruction. While this does not prevent a conviction, it does contribute to the ongoing sense of incompleteness that surrounds the case. Similarly, the lack of direct eyewitness testimony means that the sequence of events must be inferred from indirect evidence, further emphasizing the role of interpretation in shaping the final narrative. As the case continues to be discussed and analyzed, it serves as a point of reference for understanding how complex criminal cases unfold over time. It demonstrates that the path from investigation to verdict is not always linear, and that conclusions reached at one stage may be revisited as new information or perspectives emerge. It also illustrates the importance of critical examination, both within the legal system and in the broader public sphere, where cases are often reevaluated long after formal proceedings have ended. In this way, the Lundy case contributes to an ongoing dialogue about the nature of justice, the reliability of evidence, and the processes by which truth is established in situations where certainty is difficult to achieve. Ultimately, the legacy of the case lies not in providing definitive answers, but in prompting continued reflection. It reminds us that the pursuit of justice is not only about reaching conclusions, but about understanding the limitations within which those conclusions are formed. It highlights the need for careful consideration of evidence, awareness of the potential for error, and recognition of the human impact at the center of every case. For Christine and Amber Lundy, whose lives were taken in an act of violence that remains deeply disturbing, the story is one of loss that cannot be undone. For those who study and reflect on the case, it is a reminder that some questions may remain open, not because they lack importance, but because the answers are not fully within reach. And it is in that space between what is known and what remains uncertain that the Lundy case continues to exist, not as a closed chapter, but as an enduring and unresolved narrative that challenges the boundaries of understanding and the meaning of justice itself. Looking back across the full span of the Lundy case, from the ordinary rhythms of family life in Palmerston North to the decades of legal proceedings and public debate that followed, what remains most striking is not only the violence of the crime itself, but the enduring uncertainty that surrounds its interpretation. In many true crime cases, time brings a gradual settling of facts into a widely accepted narrative, even if not everyone agrees with the outcome. In this case, however, time has not erased doubt. Instead, it has preserved it, allowing the same set of events to be viewed through multiple lenses that do not fully converge. This persistence of competing interpretations has made the case a lasting subject of analysis, not because it is unsolved in a legal sense, but because it continues to resist a single, universally accepted understanding. At the center of every discussion remain Christine Lundy and her daughter Amber, whose lives were abruptly ended in a way that defies the expectations of safety within one's own home. Their deaths are not abstract elements within a legal narrative, but the defining reality from which everything else flows. The focus on evidence, timelines, and courtroom arguments can sometimes obscure this fact, yet it is essential to return to it because it grounds the case in its human dimension. Whatever conclusions are drawn about responsibility or process, the loss itself is absolute and irreversible. The inability to fully reconcile the circumstances of that loss is part of what gives the case its continuing emotional and intellectual weight. One of the most significant features of the case is the reliance on reconstruction rather than direct observation. Without eyewitnesses, without a recovered weapon, and without a single piece of evidence that conclusively defines the sequence of events, the case depends on assembling fragments into a coherent whole. This process of reconstruction is both necessary and inherently limited. It requires investigators and courts to interpret incomplete data, to make judgments about probability and plausibility, and to present those judgments in a way that meets the standard of proof required by law. In the Lundy case, this process resulted in two distinct timelines presented in separate trials. each differing in critical ways, yet both leading to the same conclusion. This outcome highlights the flexibility of interpretation within certain evidentiary boundaries and raises important questions about how certainty is constructed when direct proof is unavailable. The role of forensic science in this reconstruction further complicates the picture. Scientific methods are often perceived as objective and definitive. Yet their application in real-world cases involves interpretation, context, and sometimes uncertainty. In this case, the shift from the initial interpretation of biological material to the later use of more advanced techniques reflects the evolving nature of scientific understanding. While these developments can enhance the ability to analyze evidence, they also introduce new variables, including questions about validation, consistency, and the degree of confidence that can be placed in the results. The debates surrounding these methods in the Lundy case illustrate how science and law intersect in ways that are not always straightforward, particularly when the stakes involve life-altering judgments. Public response to the case has mirrored these complexities. The division of opinion is not merely a difference of perspective, but a reflection of deeper questions about how people evaluate evidence and assign trust. Some view the outcome of the trials as a demonstration of the legal system functioning as intended, reaching a conclusion based on the available evidence and reaffirming that conclusion through multiple levels of review. Others see the same process as indicative of potential flaws, pointing to the changing timelines and contested forensic evidence as reasons to question the certainty of the verdict. This divergence has allowed the case to remain active in public discourse, as new analyses and interpretations continue to emerge over time. The release of Mark Edward Lundy in 2025, after more than 2 decades in prison, added another layer to this ongoing narrative. His release did not resolve the questions that have followed the case. Rather, it underscored them. He continues to assert his innocence, maintaining a position that contrasts with the conclusions reached by the courts. This contrast between personal claim and legal determination is not unique to this case, but here it is amplified by the existing uncertainties, ensuring that the discussion does not end with his release. Instead, it becomes part of a broader reflection on how justice is experienced, both by those directly involved and by those who observe from a distance. In considering the broader implications of the case, it becomes clear that its significance extends beyond the specific details of the crime. It serves as an example of how complex cases can challenge the assumptions that often accompany discussions of justice. It shows that legal conclusions, while authoritative, do not always eliminate doubt, and that the process of reaching those conclusions can itself become a subject of scrutiny. It also highlights the importance of ongoing evaluation, as new methods and perspectives can alter the way evidence is understood, even long after a case has been decided. Ultimately, the Lundy case endures because it occupies a space where certainty and uncertainty coexist. It is a case with a legal resolution, but without universal agreement. A case in which the available evidence supports a conclusion while also leaving room for questions that cannot be fully answered. This duality ensures that it remains relevant, not only as a historical event, but as a continuing point of reference for discussions about the nature of truth, the limits of evidence, and the meaning of justice. For those who revisit the case, whether as part of legal study, forensic analysis, or personal reflection, it offers an opportunity to engage with these questions in a way that is both challenging and necessary. And at the heart of that engagement, always, are the lives of Christine and Amber Lundy, whose story continues to be told not because it is simple or resolved, but because it compels us to confront the complexities that define it. As the Lundy case settles into history, it does so without the kind of clean resolution that many expect from the justice system. leaving instead a layered legacy that continues to invite examination. It is a case defined not only by what is known, but by what remains uncertain. And it is within that space of uncertainty that its long-term significance takes shape. Over the years, the details have been documented, argued, and revisited, yet the central tension has not disappeared. The deaths of Christine Lundy and her daughter Amber remain the unchanging core of the case. An act of violence that transformed a private family tragedy into a national point of discussion. Around that core, the narrative expands into questions about evidence, interpretation, and the processes by which conclusions are reached when clarity is limited. The progression of the case, from initial investigation to conviction, from appeal to retrial, and finally to release after decades in prison, illustrates how legal outcomes can evolve over time without necessarily resolving all underlying doubts. Each stage added information, but also introduced new questions, particularly when the prosecution's timeline shifted between trials and when the interpretation of forensic evidence changed. These developments did not erase the earlier narrative. Instead, they layered additional complexity onto it, creating a situation in which multiple frameworks for understanding the same event coexist. This coexistence does not invalidate the legal outcome, but it does highlight the challenges inherent in cases where direct evidence is absent and where reconstruction becomes the primary tool for establishing what occurred. The reliance on circumstantial evidence in the Lundy case is one of the factors that continues to shape its legacy. Circumstantial evidence, by its nature, requires interpretation and connection, forming a network of inference rather than a single, definitive link. In many cases, such evidence can be compelling when considered collectively, yet it also leaves room for alternative interpretations, particularly when key elements, such as a murder weapon or eyewitness testimony, are missing. In this case, those missing elements have remained unresolved, ensuring that the narrative retains a degree of openness even after multiple legal decisions. The role of forensic science further reinforces this dynamic. The evolution from the initial identification of a biological stain as possible brain tissue to the later use of advanced analytical methods reflects both progress and uncertainty. Scientific techniques can provide powerful insights, but they also depend on interpretation, context, and the limitations of available technology at the time. The debates that arose over these methods in the Lundy case underscore the importance of understanding not only what science can reveal, but also what it cannot definitively prove. This distinction becomes particularly significant in legal settings, where the threshold for certainty is high and where the consequences of error are profound. Public engagement with the case has mirrored these complexities, with opinions remaining divided long after the legal process concluded. Some accept the outcome as justified, emphasizing the convergence of evidence and the affirmation of the verdict through multiple judicial levels. Others remain cautious, pointing to the changes in prosecution theory and the contested nature of key evidence as reasons for continued skepticism. This division is not easily reconciled, as it reflects differing approaches to evaluating uncertainty and differing expectations about what constitutes proof beyond reasonable doubt. The case, therefore, continues to function as a point of reference in broader discussions about trust in the justice system and the interpretation of complex evidence. The release of Mark Edward Lundy in 2025 did not resolve these divisions. Instead, it brought them into sharper focus. His continued assertion of innocence contrasts with the legal determination of guilt, creating a dual narrative that persists beyond the courtroom. This contrast is not unique in criminal cases, but in the context of the Lundy case, it is amplified by the existing uncertainties, ensuring that the discussion remains active. The conditions of his release, including restrictions on his movements and initial limitations on media engagement, reflect the balance that the system seeks to maintain between enforcement of the sentence and the realities of reintegration. Yet these conditions do not address the broader questions that continue to surround the case, leaving them to be considered in public and academic discourse rather than resolved through legal means. In reflecting on the full arc of the case, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in its outcome, but in the questions it raises about how truth is established. It challenges the assumption that every case can be fully explained, and it demonstrates that even when a legal conclusion is reached, the process of understanding may continue. This ongoing process is not a failure of the system, but rather an acknowledgement of the complexity inherent in reconstructing events that were not directly observed and that left behind incomplete evidence. It is within this acknowledgement that the case finds its enduring relevance. The story of the Lundy case is therefore not confined to the past. It continues to inform present discussions about evidence, forensic science, and the nature of justice. It serves as a reminder that the pursuit of certainty is often constrained by the limits of available information, and that the conclusions reached within those limits must be understood in context. For those who study the case, it offers an opportunity to examine these constraints in detail, to consider how decisions are made, and to reflect on the balance between confidence and doubt. For those who encounter the case more broadly, it presents a narrative that is both compelling and unresolved, inviting continued engagement rather than providing a final answer. And at the center of that narrative, unchanged by time or interpretation, are Christine and Amber Lundy, whose lives and deaths remain the defining elements of a case that continues to challenge, to divide, and to endure.